Hello and welcome to part 5 of the MESHUGGAH Discography series. I thought today we would have a look at Nothing, which is their 2002 album. This is their 2006 reissue of it though. I thought I'd point that out because there is a bit of a difference between the two versions. I believe on this version it's more crisp and more defined, and it's a bit more sludgy on the original. And that's partly down to the fact that they didn't have that much freedom of time on the original in terms of like the mixing and mastering process right towards the end, before they had to head out and go on tour. I think that's what the case was anyway. But I personally prefer this reissue, and that's always sort of been my experience with reissues, that you're almost sort of bound to fall in love with the version you hear first. So some people are going to like the original first, some people are going to like the reissue first, but regardless of which you hear first, this is a very, very good album, but I thought I'd just point that out to you. Now, this can almost be seen as a bit of a turning point in Meshuggah's music. Prior to this album, it was very thrashy and very technical and fast, whereas this album sort of shows a more kind of slow and pummeling and lethargic sound, with the transition from the 7-string guitars up to 8-string guitars. And that's one of the reasons why I guess this album has garnered so much attention. I'm not sure if it's one of the first which has used 8-string guitars, but it's certainly one of the most noticeable, and it's just so heavy. You have songs such as Rational Gaze, which even though the first riff is only 2 notes, it is just crushing. It is absolutely just awesome how heavy just those 2 notes can be. Another very good example would be Perpetual Black Second, which I think is the 3rd song on this album, where the drums are in 4/4, as they usually are, but the riff is in 7/8, which gives it a very revolving and very kind of bending feel, and that is just an incredible song, and I'd highly recommend that. And this album also includes the song Spasm, which I think is one of the songs with the lowest tunings I've ever heard. It's down in B flat, which is the B flat, the semitone lower than a standard tune 5-string bass, which is just ridiculous if you think about it. But surprisingly, on the reissue, that note is actually really audible. You can actually hear it. Whereas if the production would have been a bit more lackluster, it may not have been quite as noticeable. So that's very good. The production actually brings out how heavy this album really is. So I'd really recommend almost listening to the reissue, but it doesn't really matter which one. But it's definitely really highlighted when you have a good production quality. Now, with this kind of heaviness that this album is able to produce, it's also quite spacey at the same time on a few songs, such as Closed Eye Visuals, Nebulous and Obsidian, the last 2 songs. On those songs there are some intermittent kind of clean sections on the guitars, which really give it an ambient kind of sound compared to the other songs on this album, and that's a really powerful kind of aspect, because this album is really swallowing in terms of how heavy it is in certain places. So it's quite a nice breather, and it sort of makes it kind of flow a bit more. And that's something I really like on this. Now, despite this being such a slow and heavy and sludgy, almost quite stoner album in some respects, you do have a lot of technical work going on at the same time. So that's an aspect that isn't being neglected, so you don't need to worry about that. You have some very, very interesting drum work going on, especially in the songs Stenger and Straws Pulled at Random. Very layered, a lot of tom work going on, and a lot of sort of really syncopated snare work going on at the same time, which sort of give it an impression that it's not in a typical time signature, but quite often it is. Again, another example of how they're sort of misinterpreted by some people. But that's a very, very interesting aspect, despite this album being really slow. You have a lot of really interesting work going on, so it's still technical at the same time. Also, the solo work on this album on the guitars really helps bring forth that technical vibe as well, because you do have some really erratic solos on this album, such as on Glints Collide and Perpetual Black Second, sort of the crazy tapping style that Frederick Thorndahl is sometimes quite well known for, especially on, I don't know, Future Breed Machine perhaps, and on his solo work as well, Sol Nigel Within. But some of the solos on this album also have a really cool kind of Holdsworth almost vibe to them, especially on Stenger and Straws Pulled at Random. It's very kind of melodic, compared to some of the erratic work that they're known for. So that was a very interesting thing to sort of hear on this album when I first picked it up. It's got like a really good kind of mixture of the two solo styles, sort of like similar almost to Destroy, Erase, Improve. So that's really cool. But in terms of weak points on this album, I don't find it quite as engaging, like the whole way through, as some of their previous albums, or the albums that come after this, in fact, as well, because it's so slow that it almost, at some points, detracts from there being any flow at all. That's just my personal view, but I think that this kind of like sludgy kind of sound does sort of like weaken it a little bit, and like it can be, I wouldn't say boring, but it's not as engaging, like I said. And also the final song on this album, Obsidian, it starts off really well, in my opinion. I love the clean guitars and how it sort of like builds up a little bit in the guitars that are like being layered underneath. But as soon as the distortion is kicked on in the guitar and the drums get introduced, I just find it really quite like boring. It does get dull very quickly because it's like really repetitive. I think that song works much, much better in a sort of live context. When I saw them live last year with some friends, they actually opened with Obsidian, which was really quite cool. It was it acted as like a fantastic opener, and just like a really powerful kind of vibe. You can imagine like the lights going up as soon as the distorted guitar kicks in. So that's something to take note of possibly as well. That song does work better in a live context, and maybe that song, if it had been shortened, would have worked well as like an opening song to this album, as opposed to Stenga. But I don't know. Depends on the listener as well, I suppose. Overall, though, I would give this album a 7 out of 10. I think it's got some very, very strong songs on it, and it is a very interesting sort of direction that they took from their like previous work back in the 90s. And it does have some very nice solo work in there as well, but not quite as engaging, in my opinion, as their previous work and the albums that come after this. I mean, you can listen to Catch 33 over 50 times and you can still like imagine it was your first time listening to it. That's why that album is fantastic. But 7 out of 10, definitely give it a listen. Be patient with it, because there are some times where it does like get really slow, and that may put some people off, but it is a very good album, so definitely pick it up, and I'll see you guys next video.